Okay, so let's dive into a war that pulled in the world's biggest superpowers, a war that cost millions of lives, and, get this, a war that never actually ended. We're talking about the Korean War, which for a long time has been called the Forgotten War.
It's a really good question, right? How can something so huge be forgotten? Well, it's kind of sandwiched between the epic, clear-cut story of World War II and the televised chaos of Vietnam. So, the Korean War, it just tends to fade into the background. But its story is brutal, it's absolutely pivotal, and, most importantly, it's unresolved. So, let's unpack all of that.
To really get how this all started, we have to rewind the clock back to the end of World War II. As the dust was settling, the future of a newly freed Korea wasn't being decided by Koreans. Nope, it was being decided by superpowers thousands of miles away.
What was supposed to be just a temporary measure, a quick fix, became a permanent scar. The 38th parallel, a line literally drawn on a map by a couple of American colonels in a hurry. It hardened into a real-life Iron Curtain. And by 1949, when both the Soviet and U.S. troops pulled out, they left behind two very angry, hostile states, each armed and each convinced that they were the one and only rightful ruler of the entire peninsula.
I mean, look at this. It's the entire Cold War in a nutshell. In the north, you've got the communist Kim Il-sung, backed by the Soviet Union, and in the south, you've got the staunchly anti-communist Syngman Rhee, backed by the United States. But here's the crucial part. The Soviets gave the North serious offensive hardware, tanks, artillery. The U.S., on the other hand, was worried the South might try to start something, so they only provided lighter weapons. This was a seriously unbalanced and dangerous situation.
So, on June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung, having gotten the green light from Stalin, launched this massive, surprise invasion across the 38th parallel. And that kicked off a war that was just a violent back-and-forth seesaw of who had the upper hand.
And that initial invasion was just devastatingly effective. Seoul, the capital of the South, fell in only 3 days. The South Korean and the first few American troops there were totally outgunned and unprepared. Within just a few weeks, they were trapped in this tiny, desperate little corner of land around the port of Pusan. To the rest of the world, it looked like the war was already over.
But then, the first huge plot twist. General Douglas MacArthur decided to gamble everything on this incredibly risky amphibious landing way behind enemy lines at a place called Incheon. And it was a complete masterstroke. It worked perfectly. The North Korean supply lines were severed, their army just crumbled. UN troops took back Seoul and then just kept on going, surging north all the way to China's border.
But MacArthur had made a huge miscalculation. He totally ignored these very clear warnings from Beijing and pushed his forces way too far. In late October, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops secretly poured across the Yalu River and just slammed into the unsuspecting UN forces. The result was a catastrophic rout, one of the longest retreats in American military history, with legendary, ferocious battles like the one at the Chosin Reservoir, fought in these just unbelievably frigid, brutal conditions.
Okay, so after the absolute shock of the Chinese intervention, that chaotic retreat finally stopped. UN forces managed to regroup and push back. Seoul actually changed hands for a fourth and final time, and then the battle lines just hardened, right back where the whole thing started, around the 38th parallel. The war of massive, sweeping movements was over, and what replaced it was 2 years of grinding, bloody, miserable trench warfare over these desolate hills with brutal names like Pork Chop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge.
And the human cost of this horrible seesaw? It's just staggering. We're talking an estimated 3 million dead. And the vast majority, maybe up to 70%, were civilians. People who were caught in massacres, who starved, or who were killed by these relentless bombing campaigns that flattened pretty much every single city in North Korea.
And the military losses, they were immense on all sides. As you can see, China and North Korea definitely bore the heaviest burden, with losses estimated way up in the hundreds of thousands. But for South Korea, the United States, and the 20 other UN countries that sent people, the cost was also just profound. Tens of thousands of young men who never came home.
So, after 2 long years of this bloody deadlock and incredibly difficult negotiations, the fighting finally came to a stop. But, and this is a big but, the end of the shooting did not mean the end of the war.
Okay, this right here is probably the most important thing to get about the entire Korean War. What was signed on July 27, 1953, was an armistice, a truce, a ceasefire. It was not a peace treaty. It was basically just an agreement to stop shooting at each other, and it left all the big political problems that started the war totally unresolved. So this armistice created a whole new reality. It set up the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, which is this heavily armed no man's land that cuts the peninsula into even today. And here's a telling detail. South Korea's own president at the time, Syngman Rhee, actually refused to even sign the thing. The two Koreas were, and technically still are, at war.
So why should we remember this so-called forgotten war? Well, because that armistice in 1953 didn't really end the story. It just hit the pause button. And the consequences of that frozen conflict are still shaping our world in some really profound ways.
The legacy of this war is everywhere. It cemented that powerful military alliance between the US and South Korea. For the North, the absolute devastation they experienced, combined with that ongoing threat, it fueled decades of isolation and that desperate drive to get nuclear weapons. For millions of Korean families, it meant being permanently split apart by the DMZ, one of the most tense borders on the planet. And it sent the two Koreas down completely different roads. The South rebuilt itself into an economic giant, while the North, well, it remained trapped in the past.
And all of that brings us to the final lingering question. The ceasefire has held, more or less, for over 70 years now, but it's a fragile, uneasy quiet, constantly interrupted by crises and provocations. The search for a real, lasting peace on the Korean peninsula. That remains one of the great unfinished challenges of the 20th century, a constant, lingering echo of a war that we really shouldn't forget.